In July of 1923, a 48-year-old man climbed out of a cave somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales. He was soaking wet, covered in mud, and grinning like an idiot. Instead of changing into dry clothes, he hopped into a three-wheeled vehicle he had designed himself and drove home to Bradford through the cold English rain, still wearing his damp boiler suit. 3 weeks later, he was dead from pneumonia. His name was Alfred Angas Scott, and the motorcycle he created in 1908 was so far ahead of the competition that the racing authorities literally had to penalize him for being too good. His bike featured water cooling, a twin-cylinder engine, a kickstart mechanism, chain final drive, and a low triangulated frame layout that looked decades ahead of anything else on the road. But the craziest part of this story is not the bike itself. It is what happened after Alfred died, and how his little Yorkshire invention quietly shaped the entire history of motorcycling, war machines, Swedish car manufacturing, and even Steve McQueen's garage. So let's go back to where it all started. Bradford, England, 1874. Alfred Angas. Scott was born into a large and wealthy merchant family in the Manningham district. He was one of at least 12 children. His mother died when he was young, and he was sent to Abbotsholme School in Staffordshire, then apprenticed to the shipbuilding firms of Douglas and Grant in Kirkcaldy, Scotland, and to W. Sisson and Company in Gloucester. This is the detail that explains everything that comes after. Alfred Scott was not a motorcycle guy. He was a marine engineer. He thought in terms of ship engines, water cooling, continuous power strokes, and centrally mounted flywheels. When he looked at the motorcycles of his era, clunky air-cooled four-stroke singles with leather belt drives and pedal starts, he did not see innovation. He saw a problem begging for a better solution. By 1897, still in his early 20s, Scott had already taken out his first patent for a bicycle caliper brake. But it was his 1904 patent that changed everything. It was a vertical twin-cylinder two-stroke engine that used water cooling, at a time when the idea of putting water jackets on a motorcycle engine would have gotten you laughed out of any workshop in England. He followed it up in 1908 with patents for a triangulated frame made entirely of straight tubes, and for the first patented motorcycle kickstart mechanism, patent GB 27667. It was a Powell and ratchet system he had originally designed as a marine engine starter. Before this, riders had to bump start their bikes, or pedal them like bicycles, to get the engine turning. The first 6 complete Scott motorcycles were built under contract by the Jowett brothers in Bradford, who later went on to become a famous British car manufacturer themselves. Scott then set up his own factory at Mornington Works on Grosvenor Street in Bradford, before moving in 1913 to a purpose-built facility at Hurstwood Works in Saltaire, a building that still stands today. Now here's where you need to understand just how alien this motorcycle was compared to everything else on the market. Think about what 1908 actually looked like. The first Model T Ford had just gone on sale. Wilbur Wright had just taken his first passenger up in an aeroplane in France. King Edward VII was on the British throne, and motoring was still a rich man's hobby. The dominant motorcycles from Triumph, Royal Enfield, Matchless, Indian, and Harley-Davidson were essentially motorized bicycles. Air-cooled, single-cylinder four-stroke engines. Leather belt final drives that slipped in the rain. No kickstart, so you had to run alongside the bike and jump on. Rigid forks. A single gear. Scott's 1908 machine had a water-cooled two-stroke parallel twin, a 2-speed gearbox with a foot-operated selector, an all-chain final drive, sprung front forks, a kickstarter, unit construction of the engine and gearbox, and a low center of gravity from that triangulated straight-tube frame. The Triumph Type H, which is generally considered the first modern motorcycle, would not arrive until 1915, and it still used a belt drive and an air-cooled single. Scott had moved past that template 7 years earlier. The result was a machine that was decades ahead of its competitors. The bike also had one of the most distinctive sounds in motorcycling history. Riders called it the Scott Yowl. Some described it as a scalded cat. Others compared it to a marine engine screaming. The definitive book on Scott motorcycles, written by Jeff Clew in 1974, is titled The Scott Motorcycle, the Yowling Two-Stroke. The original cylindrical fuel tank was painted purple, reportedly the favorite color of Alfred Scott's sister-in-law, with 2 silver bands symbolizing 2-stroke, 2-cylinder, 2-speed. Scott even registered the bike with the number plate AK222 to hammer the point home. In 1908, Scott was doing branding that would not look out of place in a modern advertising agency. But the real proof came on the hills. Scott personally entered his motorcycle in hill climb competitions at Sutton Bank, Newnham, and Wassbank, and he kept beating 4-stroke machines with much bigger engines. The 4-stroke manufacturers were furious. So the Autocycle Union, the governing body of British motorcycle racing, introduced a handicap specifically targeting 2-stroke machines. Scott's stated engine capacity had to be multiplied by 1.32 for competitive classification. The idea was to slow him down. It backfired completely. The handicap became the best advertising Scott could have asked for. The message it sent was simple: this bike is so fast and efficient that they literally had to change the rules. And then Scott took his Yowling 2-stroke to the most dangerous race in the world, the Isle of Man Tourist Trophy. In 1909, Scott entered his first TT. His rider, Eric Myers, crashed out on lap 7, not the debut anyone wanted. In 1910, Frank Phillip brought the Scott home in 9th place, with an average speed of nearly 45 miles per hour, making it the first 2-stroke engine to ever complete a TT race. In 1911, Phillip set the outright TT lap record at 50.11 miles per hour. But his rotary inlet valve slipped out of timing and he was forced to retire. Close, but not quite. Then came 1912, and this is where the story gets truly wild. The senior TT took place on the 1st of July 1912. Frank Appleby lined up on a 486 cubic centimeters Scott Twin, one of the smallest engines in the entire field. What happened next is one of the great underdog stories in motorsport history. He led from the drop of the flag, not just led, but dominated. Over 187.5 miles of the most treacherous public roads on Earth, with stone walls inches from the racing line, blind corners, wet patches, and no runoff areas, Appleby never gave up the lead for a single lap. He crossed the finish with an average speed of 48.69 miles per hour and beat Jack Haswell on his Triumph single by nearly 7 minutes. His teammate Frank Phillip would have finished second, but his tire came off the rim at Balog Bridge, dropping him all the way to 11th. It was the first time a 2-stroke had ever won the TT, and the first time any rider had led the entire race from start to finish. The following year, in 1913, Tim Wood won the senior TT on another Scott. It was Wood's first ever road race, but that victory was overshadowed by tragedy. During the race, Rudge rider Frank Bateman suffered a puncture while leading, lost control below Keppel Gate, and was killed. It was the first fatality in the senior TT race itself. In 1914, Tim Wood was leading again on his Scott when the Bosch 4 Spark Magneto failed on the final lap. Scott still set the fastest lap for the 3rd consecutive year. 3 weeks later, World War I began and the TT was suspended. But the war did not sideline the Scott motorcycle. It put it straight into combat. Alfred Scott had demonstrated a motorcycle sidecar combination carrying a Vickers belt-fed water-cooled machine gun at the 1913 Olympia show in London. The concept was radical. 3 Scott motorcycles working as a team, 1 carrying the Vickers gun, 1 carrying ammunition, and 1 as a spare. In 1915, a demonstration was held in the grounds of Buckingham Palace, and Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, reportedly inspected the machines. Early Scott combinations were taken into service. According to Military History Monthly, Scott supplied around 1,400 machine gun combinations to the British forces early in the war. They were deployed in 18 machine batteries under the Motor Machine Gun Service, formed in November 1914. Kleino later became the standard motorcycle for that service, but Scott had proved the concept first. For context, this was one of the earliest organized uses of motorcycles as dedicated, mobile weapons platforms. Not just messengers, not just dispatch riders, actual gun carriers. This is the part where things stop being funny, though. Alfred Scott himself left his own motorcycle company during the war. The exact year is disputed. Some sources say 1915, others 1919, but the outcome is the same. He formed the Scott Auto Car Company at Lidgett Green in Bradford and turned his rejected military three-wheeled armored gun carriage concept into a civilian vehicle, the Scott Sociable. And the Sociable was something. Picture a three-wheeler with two wheels in line on the right side and a single outrigger wheel on the left. A 578 cubic centimeter water-cooled two-stroke twin for power. 3-speed shaft drive, no reverse. 2 independent rear brakes operated separately by hand and foot. It looked like something out of a steampunk fever dream, and it sold from 1921 to 1925 in small numbers. This was the vehicle Alfred Scott was driving when he came out of that cave in July 1923. Soaking wet after a potholing expedition with the Gritstone Club, of which he was the second president. Too excited or too stubborn to change his clothes. The open-top Sociable offered no protection from the rain on the drive back to Bradford. He developed pneumonia and died on August 11, 1923, at the age of 48. The man who patented the kickstarter, pioneered water-cooled motorcycles, built machines that won the Isle of Man TT, and armed the British military, was killed by a combination of cave moisture and his own eccentric three-wheeled car. You genuinely could not write this. Without Alfred, the Scott Motorcycle Company survived, but gradually became more conventional. However, it also produced its most iconic models. The Squirrel in 1922 was a 486 cubic centimeter sports model that guaranteed 60 miles per hour. The Super Squirrel followed in 1925 with 498 and 596 cubic centimeter options and polished aluminum dome cylinder heads. Then in 1926, the model that defines the Scott name was launched at the Olympia show, the Flying Squirrel. Water-cooled, brass-trimmed, with a distinctive honeycomb radiator that used thermosiphon convection cooling, meaning no water pump was needed. The hot coolant simply rose through the system by natural convection, exactly like a Model T Ford. The crankcase doors were painted green for racing models, or red for road bikes, and the centrally positioned flywheel with twin inboard main bearings gave the engine a smoothness that four-stroke singles could not match. Depending on engine size and year of production, it made somewhere between 25 and 30 horsepower and was good for roughly 70 to 80 miles per hour. It cost almost twice as much as a competing four-stroke. The motorcycle press eventually nicknamed it the Bugatti of motorcycles. But the company was never the same without Alfred. The Depression hit hard. A 750 cubic centimeter three-cylinder engine was developed in the mid-1930s by designer William Cull, and it is now considered one of the world's first superbike prototypes. Only a handful were ever built. And then, William Cull did something in 1939 that almost nobody knows about, and this might be the most underrated fact in the entire history of motorcycle engineering. Cull, working at Scott's Saltaire factory, patented a loop scavenge system with a third boost transfer port positioned opposite the exhaust port. This design dramatically improved two-stroke engine efficiency. The patent, UK number 512980, was filed in 1939. It was used in the PA stationary engine Scott built during World War II for Bofors anti-aircraft generators. Now, if you know anything about two-stroke racing history, you've heard the story of Walter Kaden at MZ in East Germany. Kaden is universally credited with cracking the two-stroke code in the late 1950s, using loop scavenging and expansion chamber exhausts to extract double the expected horsepower from small engines. Ernst Degner then defected to the West in 1961 and handed the technology to Suzuki, which launched the Japanese two-stroke racing revolution. That story is mostly true, but one critical piece of that architecture, the boost port loop scavenge idea, had already been patented at Scott almost 20 years earlier. Kaden combined it with expansion chambers and disc valves to create something far more potent, but the underlying port layout, that came out of Yorkshire, not East Germany. This is one of the great overlooked footnotes in motorcycle engineering. After the war, the Scott Company struggled. The Flying Squirrel was still in production but had become heavier and more expensive. The company went into voluntary liquidation in 1950. Matt Holder's Erco Jig and Tool Company in Birmingham bought the rights in 1956 and produced a handful of updated Birmingham Scotts with telescopic forks and swinging arm rear suspension. A new model called the Swift was announced in 1958 but never reached production. In the 1970s, George Silk built about 21 Silk Scott specials using Scott engines and Spondon engineering frames. then designed an all-new 653 cubic centimeters engine for the Silk 700S with help from Rolls-Royce engineer David Migelow and Queen's University Belfast professor Gordon Blair, the same theorist behind Yamaha's racing engines. The Silk 700S made around 48 horsepower and could top 100 miles per hour. Production of any motorcycle bearing the Scott name finally ended around 1978. But here is the thing that makes Alfred Scott's story so much bigger than one motorcycle company in Yorkshire. Those three-cylinder engines Scott developed in the 1930s? According to Scott historians, two of them were supplied to the German manufacturer DKW through Scott's French importer Clement Garreau. DKW's later three-cylinder two-stroke car engines appear to have been influenced by Scott's earlier work. After World War II split Germany in half, the Schopau factory ended up in the Soviet zone. The engine technology forked into the East German IFA and the Wartburg. Nearly 2 million Wartburg cars were built before the Berlin Wall fell in 1991, running on an engine family with roots tangled up with Scott, DKW, and the post-war East German state. Meanwhile in Sweden, the Saab 93 of 1956 used a closely related DKW-derived three-cylinder two-stroke. A Yorkshire motorcycle engine's influence ended up in a Swedish car. The world is a weird place. And in 1980, Yamaha launched the RD350LC, liquid-cooled two-stroke parallel twin, the bike that defined an entire generation of riders in Britain. Motorcycle News explicitly pointed out that RD350LC buyers thought liquid cooling was some kind of new technology. Alfred Scott had patented a liquid-cooled two-stroke twin 76 years before. The basic idea Scott championed, compact liquid-cooled two-stroke performance, echoes through the Yamaha TZ racers, the Suzuki RG series, and the entire Japanese two-stroke revolution that followed. A marine engineer in Bradford proved the concept. The rest of the world spent decades catching up to it. And the story has some incredible final chapters. Steve McQueen, the king of cool, owned at least two Scotts. A 1929 596 cubic centimeter Super Squirrel was hand pinstriped by legendary customizer Kenneth Von Dutch Howard, complete with Von Dutch's famous flying eyeball logo on the toolbox. McQueen also owned a 1937 498 cubic centimeters Flying Squirrel in a sidecar combination. It was sold after his death, and it went through Bonhams at Stafford in April 2025 for £13,800, including the buyer's premium, well below its £25,000 to £35,000 estimate. And then there is Captain Sir Tom Moore, the centenarian, who raised £33 million for NHS charities in 2020 by walking laps of his garden during lockdown. As a young man, Tom Moore raced a Scott Flying Squirrel. That motorcycle is now on long-term display at Bradford Industrial Museum, just a few miles from the factory where it was built. The 1913 TT winning Scott, the bike Tim Wood rode to victory in his very first road race on the day Frank Bateman was killed, is preserved at the National Motorcycle Museum in Solihull. The unique three-cylinder prototype lives at the Sammy Miller Museum in Hampshire, alongside original factory drawings and molds. Despite relatively modest total production numbers, more Scotts are registered with the Vintage Motorcycle Club of England than any other mark. At auction, a usable Flying Squirrel can be had for under £15,000. For context, a Mike Halewood MV Augusta GP racer sold at the same Bonham Stafford sale for £967,000. The Scott may well be the most undervalued, historically significant motorcycle in the world. Alfred Angas Scott was born in the same decade as the first practical automobile. He died in the same decade as the first transatlantic flight. In between, working from a factory in a small Yorkshire town, he helped pioneer or popularize a startling number of technologies that later became central to motorcycle design. Liquid cooling, two-stroke twins, kickstarting, low triangulated frames, unit-style engine and gearbox packaging, and advanced scavenging ideas that would not be fully exploited for another half-century. A bike conceived by a ship engineer in a rented workshop in 1908 is, technically, the great-grandparent of the Yamaha you can buy this weekend. Alfred Scott was not just ahead of his time, he was ahead of our time, and the rest of the world spent a century catching up. If this story blew your mind the way it blew mine, hit subscribe. I cover deep dives into the machines and people that shaped motorcycle history every single week. If you want more like this, the video on screen right now is one you absolutely need to see.